Good morning. I see people are joining us from around the country and around the world. My name is Dr. Heather Tarleton, and I will sort of be moderating today's presentation. And really today we're focusing on trauma-informed care as a restorative justice practice. And one thing I want to start with in terms of framing today's discussion is that number one, this is a discussion and a dialogue. I strongly encourage questions. I strongly encourage thoughts, opinions, curiosities. You can feel free to ask them audibly. You can just raise your hand and I'll kind of create a list of individuals to call on. Or you can also enter questions in the chat. Perhaps while Amy or Lavinia are speaking, if there's a question that comes up, feel free to drop that in the chat, and then we'll have ample time for questions and answers and dialogue throughout today. In addition to thinking about restorative justice practices, I want to underscore that our discussion of art therapy and yoga therapy today is really to frame it as rehabilitation of the person. A lot of times I think we think about the criminal justice system as rehabilitation for the criminal offender, but we forget that these are people, that these are individuals who have a diversity of experiences, a diversity of cultures, a diversity of traumas. And so in today's conversation, we are really thinking about rehabilitation of the individual who just happens to have had a justice involvement as part of their lifetime experience. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Amy Osborne, who is in our yoga therapy program. And then we'll just take it away, Amy.
Thank you so much. Grateful to be here and grateful for all of you who are taking the time out of your busy days to join us. I am Amy Osborne. I'm a graduate and I now work in the Graduate Yoga Studies, Masters of Arts in Yoga Studies program. And in that program, I wrote my thesis on trauma-informed mindfulness, the history, the science, and the practice. So I wanted to just briefly share a couple moments about my experience in teaching from trauma-informed approach, and then also just a snapshot of what exactly this science is in application that we're talking about when we say trauma-informed mindfulness or trauma-informed care. So after graduating the master's program in 2016, I wound up in Southwest Florida. I went there, my parents were there, I was just gonna hang for a couple months, and shortly thereafter decided to take a leap of faith and purchase what was a small yoga studio. And I developed over 3.5 years into a wellness center. And through that, I was able to apply this trauma-informed approach that I had studied in a variety of settings. I did teach in prison when I was here working with CRDF, Century Regional Detention Facility outside of Compton. And then in going to Florida, I was blessed with the opportunity to work for 2 years at a behavioral center in inpatient recovery and mental health court, so a probationary program. And then also in coastal behavioral health care, which was a juvenile inpatient detention center and a county jail facility, among others. So I've had the privilege to apply this in practice for a few years now, and I think the science is really useful, even and especially for people in this modern day and age of COVID-19 and the crises that we're working through daily. So sharing a little bit of the science that might be relevant to you, but also thinking about this broader scheme of substance abuse recovery and rehabilitation for victims of sexual assault and various traumas that compound. So thinking through your own lens and also kind of applying in this broader context. So I'm going to take a couple moments to screen share. And I just learned this little cheat. Oh, that's not gonna work. Hold on one second. Here we go. All right. So before we get into this, I'm gonna take 60 seconds with you to just find a comfortable seat and arrive if we haven't done so already. So that might be feet planted, hips width apart, the hands on the knees or in the lap. And we will have an opportunity to do a practice, trauma-informed practice together at the end of this session. But just taking a moment, you might even close the eyes or drop the gaze and just notice the breath. What's it doing? Is it in the chest or the belly? Is the breath moving at all? Just observing, not changing it, just noticing. And when you're ready, you can take a big breath in and notice the lungs expand, front and back body. Maybe the belly rises as the diaphragm lifts. And then exhale, just let it go. Big exhale breath. We'll take 2 more of those at your own pace. Taking a big breath in. Fill the lungs, even bigger than you think you can fill the lungs, 3-dimensionally like a balloon, all the way up to the top of the breath. And exhale, release it, let it go. Maybe slow and steady out the nose or out the mouth. And take 1 more breath, your own pace, your own terms. A big breath in, biggest breath yet today. And then let it go. You can observe as the body returns to neutral, kind of releases with that exhale. You can wiggle fingers and toes. Maybe move through the shoulders or the neck. If it suits you, even reach the arms up, take a big stretch, and come back to neutral. So take note if you feel any different now than you did 60 seconds or so ago. And as we look at this chart, I like to showcase this information, imagining that we're like animals in the forest and we're being chased, or if you'd rather stay human, you can be like a cave person and there's like a cheetah chasing you. So the idea is that regardless of what the traumatic event is, if it's a global pandemic, if it's, oh, my pup's coming through, hold on. Apologies. Regardless of what the event is, your body will process it the same way. We are wired the same way as we were as cave people. So in order to release a traumatic event that would spike our nervous system, we need to actually kind of move through the body and take control again of the breath. So yoga is a natural application, thinking about mindfulness as well, bringing awareness to the body, awareness to the breath, and awareness to the thoughts, where we can begin to regain control of our nervous system. So very briefly, quickest I've ever done this chart here, but you can always revisit it. I believe it went out in an email handouts, or you can reach out to me. But there is a traumatic event, whatever that is. It could just be missing a deadline. Oops, I forgot I had this meeting, or whatever it may be. And as you can see, your nervous system spikes up into fight or flight. And we have these symptoms that arise: anxiety, panic, hypertension, hypervigilance, emotional flooding, chronic pain. And so depending on the severity and the length of this event, eventually our body will begin to re-regulate. And so we see the dotted lines as kind of where we want to be. And this wavy line that looks maybe like an ocean wave is equilibrium, natural ups, natural downs, but we stay within this dotted line, the window of tolerance, how much we can handle. So when traumatic events occur, and for us in your daily life, you might bring an event to mind in the past 24 hours where you felt a little bit spiked or a little bit triggered, and noticing the symptoms as they show up in your body. Now, if you experience compounding events, depending on the severity of those events, if they're in childhood in particular, then our nervous system begins to feel that the deregulation is normal. And often substances might help us to give a false sense of re-regulation, to help us get back to that equilibrium just temporarily, ultimately setting us off even more. The body's kind of like, I don't know how to find normal anymore. What is normal? Us, 9-10 months into a pandemic, what is normal? What is normal to my nervous system? So acknowledging that each and every one of us, every living being, including dogs, and you'll notice, get riled up, and then they need to do a big stretch as we just did after that meditation, and they might yawn, and that is their body naturally re-regulating. By applying movement such as asana, yogasana, breath practices, pranayama in yoga tradition, and mindfulness and meditation to observe our own thoughts and observe our own reactions, we can begin to notice these symptoms and use tools like the breath and meditation to bring us back into this window of tolerance. So that's the application of kind of a therapeutic application of yoga and mindfulness. Can go into more later and practice with you specific techniques such as Vipassana or insight meditation that can be really useful tools as you dive deeper in this topic. So thank you.
All right, so now I just wanted to open it up, see if anyone has any immediate questions right now. Again, as always, I see some comments in the chat, but if there are any questions for Amy, if not now, then perhaps later. Okay, so with that, I'll move on to introduce Dr. Lavinia Jackson, who is currently in our Department of Marital and Family Therapy with an emphasis in art therapy. Hopefully I said that properly. And we'll have a introduction from her.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Amy, for what you shared with us already this morning. So I'm just going to give another perspective of trauma-informed care in relation to treatment. Instead of what was already given to you in the holistic way of yoga, we also have the holistic way of art therapy as a way to also work with trauma. So I'm going to share my screen because it just helps me stay on track. And oops, sorry. And that way I don't lose what I'm doing here. Great. Can everybody see it? Great. So just briefly about myself, so you just know a little bit about my background. As Dr. Tarleton shared with you, I am an assistant professor in our graduate department of marital and family therapy with a specialized training in art therapy. I have a PhD in art therapy, and I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist and a registered art therapist. Board certified. I received both of my degrees in art therapy from Notre Dame Dina Moore University in Northern California, where I'm currently located. I also recently, almost a year ago today, authored a book called Cultural Humility in Art Therapy, where I also talk about some of the things that I'm sharing with you today. And recently, I'm really excited that I was featured in Scholastic Art Magazine with an interview based on my career in art therapy. And something related to the aspect of trauma, I also have a piece in Dr. Bakos's new book that just came out this month on post-traumatic stress disorder and art therapy. So that was really exciting. And I also serve on the American Art Therapy Association Board of Directors. So I wear many hats, but in most places, my heart is with community work. So what I found working with these populations within these systems, and I've worked for the San Mateo County, which is in Northern California, with youth in residential treatment, and many of them were released from the juvenile system into our care as a way to transition back into the community. We also had individuals, unfortunately, while in our care, ended up transitioning into juvenile hall and often back again. So there was a lot of revolving going through the systems with the youth that were in our care at that time. Also, part of our department's work that we've done in this area is that in our adolescent psychotherapy course, we take our students into juvenile hall when it was not COVID, and work directly with the adolescents in juvenile hall as a way of just getting an understanding of what it's like to be in those systems, and understanding that these youth that we work with are just that, they're just children, and to kind of pull back the facade and the myth that a lot of our students come into the department with when they think about adolescents in juvenile hall. We've also recently done these, engaged in practicums with juvenile hall virtually now that we are in COVID. And we've also started these workshops with juvenile hall virtually as well. So that's been really exciting that we've been able to continue the work with Central Juvenile Hall, even amongst the pandemic. Also, I've done work with Camp Suzanne, which was a program designed between the Center of Restorative Justice works and the Federal Correction Institution in Dublin, California. It's a low security federal prison for female inmates. And what we did is a week-long experience with the mothers and their children. So the children were bused from Southern California to Northern California, where their mothers were placed. And for the week, we worked separately with the children and separately with the mothers. And then in the middle of the day, we would work with them together through an art experience in order to help the mothers and the children with bonding. Some of them had not seen their mothers in years. Some of them saw their mothers frequently, but in a different setting. So this was a way for them to be able to sit on their mother's laps, create art together, have time to talk. So I really loved engaging in that experience over the last few years, several years. So also in doing this work, what I found within these systems are that there are people, their children, their youth, their mothers, their men, their women, and that many of these systems are not equitable and are not there because, and many are not there because of the offenses that they have done, but because of the offenses done by them, by the system, and by others. So I was glad that I had the opportunity to offer restorative justice in these programs. And the lens that I use when I'm working in these systems is cultural humility. And it is imperative to examine the effects and the responses to trauma through a cultural lens. Cultural context and background, as well as membership in an oppressed or marginalized group, will affect how individuals perceive traumatic events and its impacts. So it can also determine how a youth or anyone in communities can assist in recovery. So mental health professionals, including art therapists, must be sensitive to an array of issues and provide help in a culturally responsive manner. So I come to address this through cultural humility, which is incorporating a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. So paying attention to myself and why I do this work and why I'm coming into this work. It's also about readdressing the power imbalance in the patient and physician dynamic. So understanding that I have a lot of power and privilege in where I sit as a professional, but that doesn't mean that the person who's offering their time with me is not an expert to their own experience. So it's also about developing mutual beneficial and non-paternalistic clinical and advocacy partnerships with communities on behalf of individuals and divine populations. So holding these institutions accountable, working with the people in the institutions in order to give equitable services to the people in the communities that they serve. So the links between trauma and culture are inevitable when addressing therapy. It can determine the effects of trauma as well as the response of a traumatically disruptive events. An extensive amount of my clinical experience derived from working with traumatized youth in residential treatment. So we have to know when people are coming with trauma into our settings, that we are not to neither minimize nor overestimate the experience of trauma. And that many who have been in the judicial system have experienced trauma before and during and after leaving the system. And so as an art therapist, we have to keep these cultural considerations in mind when we're working with the populations that we serve. So these are many of the cultural considerations that we need to keep in the forefront and recognize that there are systematic oppressions and institutionalized racism that can impact the exposure of trauma. And a culturally humble art therapist must examine culture through these lenses. So just thank you for giving me that moment to share that.
Great, thank you. So again, just as a reminder, feel free to post questions in the Q&A or post them in the chat or raise your hand. I have a question for you both that pertains to those of us who teach or who operate work in spaces where art therapy and yoga therapy are not our foundational trainings. What are some suggestions or approaches or thoughts on how we might approach teaching, how we might approach interactions with colleagues, where we're not necessarily, where we can try to acknowledge trauma or potential trauma in behaviors, or address it in classrooms, but where we're not necessarily trying to put someone on the spot. So sort of creating an environment, a collective environment or collective community for the acknowledgement of, where we can acknowledge trauma, but not force someone to identify or force someone to kind of, share out, given that every single one of us has experienced some level of trauma, some more than others, but we all, like, COVID, that's a traumatic experience. What are some ways in which we can use techniques from art therapy or yoga therapy to just support a space?
Yeah. I can speak on this briefly from the yoga side. I train yoga instructors in a 16-hour course, but I also do a 6-hour course with social workers in trauma-informed care. And the biggest thing, which can be controversial, especially in the counselor-client relationship, where there's a little bit of, not to say hierarchy, but a power dynamic, is to lead with your own experience. Something happened this week with one of our students. I've just been noticing little comments that were being made, and I felt the urge to reach out to this person and just say, hey, as a fellow person who's living alone in this pandemic, how are you doing? I kind of made a joke out of it, but I used my own experience and I said, I'm having these struggles. And so, how are you? And so leading with empathy is one of the quickest, easiest ways I have found, and yoga substantiates, to create safe space, so that regardless of who's showing up and what they're bringing, that they feel supported and safe in your company. So I think relating in that way.
Yeah, and I would echo that with Amy. I think I shared that already with you, that I come from a culturally humble stance. And so I do a lot of work with sharing that, and educating students and sharing other clinicians on how to come to art therapy practice from a culturally humble approach. And similar to what Amy said, it's about self-examining. So just really being aware of your own biases and assumptions and beliefs when you're doing the work. That way you're not imposing or impacting on those that you're working with, and that you're there for them, and not for yourself. And also, really being attuned again to those power dynamics that was just talked about, and really making sure that the client or the persons that you're working with, the communities that you're working with, have agency and empowerment when you're working with them.
And then sort of a follow-up question, this is wearing my faculty hat and I think about my students, and I think about the classroom, I think about pedagogy. What do you think is missing from the way in which we educate our students in classroom spaces, traditional classroom spaces, and then sort of within disciplines? I think we often have this siloed approach where we might think that addressing trauma in pedagogy is not essential because our discipline doesn't on the surface appear to be relevant to addressing trauma. What are some ways we as educators can think about addressing trauma or training students in acknowledging trauma so that even if they're not going on to become clinicians, they can still start to develop empathy or develop a mindfulness about the experiences of others?
Yeah, I can share a little bit about my the tools and the principles that I share with my students. And as you were commenting, I think what I've been sharing around cultural humility, a lot of times we like to think of trauma as like a one-time event and something that just only happens with certain individuals. And once we treat that, then everybody's okay and they continue to live a quote unquote normal life. And I think we have to understand that trauma affects everyone and affects everyone differently. And that we also have to be really aware that trauma and culture is very much linked, as I spoke about before. That if you dismiss people's cultural experience and not think about the systematic and the oppression impacts that are around us and how that will dictate how much trauma and what kinds of trauma people experience, then you're kind of negating the whole efforts of trauma informed care. People are impacted particularly around racial trauma. If you're not paying attention to someone's background and what they may have experienced just because of being a person of color or just because being a woman, and you're not keeping that in mind. And I think we remove that aspect from education and from teaching. We like to talk about the science and the research, but we don't talk about the culture. And I think we have to remember that that's so imperative in what we teach, because it implies how we look at research and education and academia.
And I see that sort of as one of the issues with a lot of the programs that are, a lot of the education focused programs that are begun or in play at um, jails or in correctional facilities or in those settings where it's this idea that we're going to impart education upon you and that's going to correct you or that's going to fix you or that's going to improve you. Yet we don't think about educating about trauma, educating individuals about how to articulate their own trauma in articulated verbally or articulated through our therapy or et cetera. And so the youth education has become a tool to fix people as opposed to a tool to allow someone to take ownership of their own development or to understand themselves and what they are feeling or experiencing and what has historically been experienced. We don't see a single unique pathway into the criminal justice system. We often see these repetitive themes of abuse and mental health issues or drug use to self-medicate, et cetera. So it's not the person who has the problem. There are a lot of other compounding issues, but we educate about the problem instead of, focusing on that person. Amy, did you have something to add?
Yeah. And I'm thinking of new things as you're both talking. One of the primary research studies that supplements the mindfulness work is the adult childhood or adverse childhood experience Kaiser Permanente study, ACE or ACEs. Social workers and counselors work intimately with the ACEs, and there is a survey that's used as an intake. Which determines if you've had a certain number of these adverse childhood experiences, then there is research to support that you will have these difficulties, which may be obesity, substance abuse, mental health issues. And so there's this direct connection between childhood experience and how that manifests or shows up later in life. There's a great documentary called Dhamma Brothers, Dhamma Brothers. It used to be free on Netflix, so see if it's out there, or Prime. But it is already maybe 30 or 40 years old, but follows a 10-day meditation retreat in a maximum security prison in Alabama. And they do a really wonderful job of sharing the stories and the process of each individual. And I think this idea of the general humanity of people as pedagogically, as a, developing curriculum, two things: outwardly creating a curriculum that is well-rounded with authors of various backgrounds, so that those all students of all backgrounds in the room feel comfortable sharing their experience. To tell your story is to heal. So the more safety we can create in spaces that can aid them. But I think practicing your own mindfulness inwardly, if that's the outward, then the inward is, having a daily practice where you just notice how you feel. In doing this work, I find that being able to be in tune with when I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling, where I am on that spike chart, allows me to walk in a room and better assess where other people are. And so I think as a leader in trauma-informed work, the more we bring those practices into our own lives, the more effective we can.
A couple questions in the Q&A. One is, how can we incorporate trauma-informed care when it comes to decision-making and supporting students outside of the classroom, such as in crisis situations that we become aware of, but they're happening outside of the classroom?
I think that's a struggle that a lot of educators are having right now, particularly because students are coming into classes with a lot of trauma just because of our day and age right now. And so I think we do have to be really careful and use a trauma-informed approach in thinking about their backgrounds, thinking about their early childhood experiences, how that might be impacting how they're feeling currently. But there's so many therapies out there that we can recommend to our students and help them seek. And there's ways, and we have lists posted on the American Art Therapy Association website if you're looking for someone in your area. Also, you can contact our department if you're wanting to help students find something that's within their budget range. But there's art therapy services, there's clinical services, we have services on campus. There's many tools out there, and I think as educators, it's important for us, if we want to come with a trauma-informed approach, to find these resources and help provide those resources to our students and empower them to seek those services in order to help them through these traumatic times and the traumatic events that they might be experiencing.
Yeah, I would just substantiate that even more to say, creating a list. I'm of that small business brain, but we would have people with somewhat moderate to severe mental health, brain injury, PTSD. And so, what do you do? What's your responsibility there? And so something that we did was create like a resource list. A lot of people, especially a PTSD population, I found, is adverse to help. They don't want to feel vulnerable in that way, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't utilize the resources. So creating and building a community list, as Dr. Jackson shared, that there's on the art therapy website, maybe finding all these different resources, and it's just like a sheet you can send to someone or hand to someone so they don't feel singled out. But now they are aware of all of these resources, and maybe some of those are low cost or free community resources. if they're LMU, then SPS is wonderful. The more I learn about SPS, Student Psychological Services, I'm just wowed by all the different groups they have in different areas of specialty. So if you're an LMU student, check that out.
There's another question in the chat that asks, in light of this past summer's uprisings, there has been a surge of support in exploring restorative justice practices as a tool for healing and deterrence rather than punitive measures. As restorative justice practitioners, have you found yourself having increased resources support in the work that you do with those who are systems impacted, or is there resistance from institutions that still hamper your work?
I think it's both and. I have many institutions that I work with or reside in who are reaching out to me since this summer's events, who are saying, you know what, that art therapy thing that you did or that art experience you had, can you come back? We need more of that. I have people who are emailing me and saying, can we get some presentations, some information, people who are really open and willing to hear more, and come with tools for the communities that they work with. And I have others who are really struggling, who are really set in the ways that they've been conducting and systematically been providing services, and are really reluctant. And there again is where having a social justice stance and really informing people how important it is to have these trauma-informed approaches within these restorative systems, so that we can see differences happening in our systematic structures.
Yeah, I think I have nothing to add on this. You said it all.
I'll add something because I think with regard to support, there is a ton of material and support and resources and websites and literature out there. But I feel like sort of we still need to strike a balance between having all of that available and then meaningfulness in its implementation. And I think it's a great question, this idea of putting extra support out there still has not addressed the barriers. Just because you do one thing, which is increasing visibility, doesn't mean you've thought structurally about decreasing barriers and thinking about things like time. To have meaningful implementation of something requires time, requires resources, financial resources, requires a lot more than just sending out book lists and websites and app lists. And I think institutions still need to shift to both increase educational opportunities, but also decrease those structural barriers. And I see one of the biggest barriers as being a willingness to support others, but a lack of willingness to think about how am I contributing to the problem, consciously or subconsciously. How am I, as a leader or as an administrator or as an important person who has decision-making power, how could I be creating perhaps a crime of omission by simply not paying attention? Maybe I've created a barrier in this system. So I think we still need the systems change to address the barriers. We are seeing the systems change to increase the valuation of education, the valuation of awareness. But I think behind the scenes, we need to really work on identifying and articulating the barriers and then start to get rid of them. And I think that's going to start with leadership to really stop and say, what is my role in this?
Yeah. If I can jump in on that, I'm very pleased that in November, California passed I don't know if it was an ordinance or state level, on funding for rehabilitative justice programs. I did recently have an opportunity to meet with a private tech company in the UK that is interested in implementing a mindfulness program in the prison system there. At the same time, I have confronted barriers at the county jail level locally and with Department of Children and Families. There's interest but lack of budget to support these types of programs. So just throwing in, and there might be a similarity with art therapy as well. There's so much free content online in yoga and mindfulness that, when you have these meetings with these higher ups, these people in power, I think value proposition in reframing the therapeutic aspects, maybe more conversation, which I believe is now happening about the importance of mental health, and that these techniques do help with that. But you can all be advocates. Everyone can be an advocate for requesting these types of services and helping to reestablish the value so that we can go in and create systems at the institutional level.
Yeah, and I would just echo that, what both of you are saying, and I think is the key is that we have to put resources into making this change. A lot of people are doing performative justice, where it's like this one-time thing, and they're looking for free services to do that. And even in the way that we're coming into juvenile hall, and juvenile hall has accepted us to come back and do so much more work with the youth that are there, we're doing it free. We're not being paid, and we're not asking to be paid, because we want to do this work in service of the youth that are in juvenile hall, but we're also doing it for our students so that they can become better clinicians in doing this work. But oftentimes in our systems and in our different institutions, they want the change, but they don't want to put the money into making the change. So we have to hold them accountable and say that if you want this work to happen, you have to put up the money to make it happen. And we have to stop looking for people to give free services in order to make things equitable. If you want things to be equitable, then that means paying people for the work that they do to help you to become equitable, just like you would pay anyone else that you would ask to provide services for you. And we also look into people of color and people from diverse backgrounds to do the work for free. And we don't want to pay them for doing the work that they do. So we have to be really careful of that.
Thank you both. I'm going to transition now over to Dr. Jackson, who will lead us in a art experiential. And before doing that, I'd just like to underscore that idea of a lot of nonprofits and practitioners have been providing pro bono work for way too long. And our systems, correctional and otherwise, we pay for top of the line restraints, ankle shackles, handcuffs, pepper spray, making sure we're fully stocked in that, yet we can't make sure that we have institutionalized the practice of creative art or the practice of expression or the practice of healing. If you don't value it, you're not going to put your money behind it. So we really have to make those changes. So Dr. Jackson, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I'm just going to briefly share my screen because I think it would be negligent of me to talk about art therapy and not really explain to people what art therapy is. And a lot of people have a misjudgment about what they think art therapy is and who practices it. So I just wanted to be really clear with you all. That art therapy is an integrative mental health and human service profession that enriches the lives of many through active art making, creative process, applied psychological theory, and human experiences with the psychotherapeutic relationship. So art therapy is facilitated by a professional art therapist, and art therapists are professionally trained master's level clinicians that work with many types of people and many populations. So you'll find a lot of people who use art therapeutically, art as a way of doing therapy, but an art therapist has particular training and particular skill. So what I'm going to offer you today is going to be just a touch of what we do. It's not something that you should replicate and think that, oh, I know how to do art therapy, or I'm an art therapist, I know how to do this. It's it takes a lot more training and consideration when you're working with someone therapeutically through art. So why we do art. It helps because it's a nonverbal way of communicating. Creating a project often helps build self-esteem. It can be a safe form of expression, meaning that it's contained and oftentimes thought about in the way that it's constructed. So it's not just like anyone who just kind of pulls out a coloring book and starts doing art, or someone in the community who's like, let's just do a mural. It's a way of visually thinking. It helps with problem solving. It offers healthy coping skills. It's a way to practice training skills. And it also helps develop insight. So there's many type of ways that art therapy can be helpful in healing. Today, I would like for you, if you have it available to you, a blank sheet of paper. It could be any type of paper, as long as it's blank. And any type of drawing or writing tools that you have available to you. So things like markers, color pencils, crayons, even highlighters. If you just have a regular pencil with you, you can use that as well. Just anything that would give you a sense of expression. And again, I'm going to just offer this as a way of just getting a touch of what we do and how we do it. So right now, I'd like for you to just take that sheet of paper and just draw whatever you like. I'll give you about 2 minutes to do that. And just whatever comes to you, put it on the paper. Just draw whatever you would like at this moment. And I don't know, Heather, if we want to time it or... And there's no right or wrong. We're not looking for Picasso's, just whatever comes to you right now. And again, using whatever materials that you have. And take another 30 seconds to kind of come to a pausing point. Doesn't have to be completely done. Just do whatever. Just pause wherever it feels right. And now I'm going to offer you another prompt. And this time, if you would use another piece of paper, again, blank, nothing on it. And any drawing tools that you have available, you can use the same ones that you used in the first drawing, or you can change it up and use something different if you choose to. You can stick to one color, you can use a lot of colors, whatever is comfortable for you. And this time I'm going to suggest that you draw what today has been like for you thus far. So what has today been like for you? It could be what you've already experienced, what you felt. It could be even what you're going to experience later today, what you anticipate. What are your thoughts and your feelings? It could be just describing the things that you've done. But take about another 2 minutes and draw what today has been like for you. And I see that Dr. Tarleton kind of put in there, let it flow out, and that sometimes she draws just circles because sometimes she's feeling like she's in a hurricane. Sometimes we do that. We doodle a lot. And a lot of us don't realize when we're doodling, it's a way for us to externalize what we're internally feeling. So again, take about another minute and draw what today has been like for you. Maybe for you, it's also circles because maybe you're feeling kind of wound up today. Maybe you're actually drawing representations of what your face looks like, or an emoji, or some color that might represent a feeling for you. Take about another 30 seconds or so to come to a place that you're comfortable to pause at. And I wish we were in a space where I could see what you all have created, or even had an opportunity to put you into breakout groups so you can share with each other what you've created. But in this space, you're going to have to do the work yourself. So basically, take a look at both of your drawings and think about the process of doing a drawing that was pretty open-ended, which in art therapy we would call a non-directive, and think about your experience of doing the drawing where I offered you a prompt, which we would call a directive, meaning that I gave you something to think about in your creating. And if one was more difficult or challenging for you, or if one felt more beneficial. And also think about, in the sense that you are not in person with us right now, and what it would be like to share that drawing in person. If you were able to show someone that drawing and actually describe to them what you drew. Maybe throughout your day-to-day, you might do that. Find someone that you can share this experience with and share with them what you drew and what you were thinking and feeling as you were drawing it. And see if that helps to externalize any internal feelings that you might have about today, about your state of being in this present moment. And again, as we're thinking about trauma, these are kind of the things that we do as art therapists. We sit in the space with someone, we guide them through some art activity or experiential, but we're really helping them to do what is needed for them at that moment. And that is processing whatever might be happening for them internally, and externalize it. So thank you for just taking a few minutes to engage in that with me.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's a great point, especially during this pandemic and during a time where we're all experiencing a lot of isolation, in which we can have a lot of feelings that come up from day to day, that we don't have a chance to express and articulate in our meetings and our classrooms, but that are there. Taking that time to use this as a way to create and express, and then finding a friend or family member or someone that you could share out with, and using that image to share out rather than, I'm not a journaler, so I'm I'm horrible at trying to, I feel like I'm supposed to write a research paper whenever I have a pen and paper. So for me, being able to just randomly create something is very freeing. It allows me to express myself without engaging that logical mind that wants to organize and structure. So again, for those of you who are sort of in an isolated state, you could have a house full of people and still feel very isolated. Using this, I think it's a great suggestion from Dr. Jackson about sharing out with someone by Zoom, by FaceTime, by socially distanced picnic, however you would like to do it. So this time I'd like to transition over to Amy, who is going to share with us yoga practice, which will help us to tap into some of those components of self-regulation and awareness of trauma. And then keep in mind that, you know, COVID-19, the pandemic, everything that's come with it, the racial injustice, the political aspect of it, it's just all been scrunched into such a short time period that I know I felt overwhelmed and flooded with so many different anxieties and concerns and thoughts. So I find this practice to also be beneficial.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Jackson. That was really cool. And I think I'll be doodling more than I have historically. Yeah, to what Dr. Tarleton is sharing about, you know, the compounding, and we'll look at that in a moment, of trauma. But I think the biggest thing when I have gone into inpatient recovery or gone into a jail, I always want to share with them, probably more than they want to know, about neuroplasticity and about nervous system regulation, because when I learned those things myself, it was a huge aha moment of nothing's wrong with me. And I'm not the only one feeling this. In fact, everyone is feeling this. And this is the science of how our bodies work. Now, where do you go from there? You can start to work with it. So that's where nervous system regulation comes in. There is a criticism of this, that we're kind of hacking the nervous system and we're not fixing the systemic problems. So I'll be the first to say we need to fix and address systemic issues such as racism, such as, you know, oppression and lack of accessibility to resources that compounds these traumas and those ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences. So with all of that in our minds, what do we have control over? And I would generally tell my 3 to 5-year-old students, what can you control right now in this moment? And they'd go, my body and my breath. And so we'll be doing a little bit with both body and breath. But it can be helpful when we're bombarded or consuming information about things that are so much bigger than ourselves, to remember that there are certain things we're in control of, and that we do have some tools to move in that moment, to be in control in that moment. So normalizing these things, this is not an oddity. So I'll share a couple slides and we will close with a meditation practice. Trauma-informed mindfulness. I shared a bit about my experience. There it is again. I want to share this definition. What is yoga? What are we even talking about? We have 2 different yoga therapy programs in addition to the Masters of Arts of Yoga Studies, in addition to 5 or 6 yoga study certificates at LMU. What is this? So this definition of yoga came out of a textbook while we were studying in India as a cohort in Lab Noon. And I love this definition. And I always like to share that in this ashram, it was primarily women, nuns, and many of them had PhDs in neuroscience. So that's a pretty cool ashram experience. So they say that equanimity is yoga, serenity is yoga, skill in action is yoga, control of the senses and the mind is yoga, anything by which the best and the highest in life can be attained by virtue is also yoga. Yoga is thus all-embracing, all-inclusive, and universal in its application, leading to all-around development of body, mind, and soul. Just that. So when you practice yoga, you know, just the highest virtue in life is what we're working toward. So we've touched on these terms, and this presentation is from my full 6-hour training, so I won't be going into it fully, but you're welcome to reach out. I actually have one coming up at the end of next week for social workers. So these are key terms. There's residual trauma, simple trauma, complex trauma. You can kind of bring to your mind how you might define these terms. If you've perhaps heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, this idea that there is residual trauma, that there's an effect in the body, an imprint that's left behind when a high stress event occurs. Simple trauma might just be a singular event. I like to use car accident or an almost car accident. When you almost get hit when you're driving, if you're in LA, you've experienced that. And what happens to your body in that moment? And you can kind of say, normally I'd have you all shout it out. What is the heart doing in that moment? Increasing. What are the muscles doing in that moment? Are you super relaxed or are you tense, right? Your muscles tense up. Do you need to stop and use the restroom? Probably not. You're probably not thinking about, when you need to go use the restroom next. You're not thinking about that. Your pupils dilate. Our digestive system is signaled to pause, go on hiatus. It's no longer a vital function because your body's preparing to run away from a cheetah, even though, this was an almost car accident, right? And so that's a simple traumatic event. Then we have complex trauma, which is this idea of compounding. And watching that Dama Brothers documentary is the perfect example of this. These people who end up in maximum security prison, and you start to hear their stories. And, one man as a baby his mom left him on a stoop. And he was, grew up fending for himself. He robbed a store, he hung out with the wrong crowd, and the complexity of the compounding, that he went to juvenile detention, and that kind of made him worse, being a punitive system versus rehabilitative. He, his mental health declined, his worldview began to become that of his environment. And so it's systemic in the way that this is complex, it's compounding over time, and all this residual trauma stays in the body. And then observational awareness is the practice of observing oneself. So as a beginner in mindfulness, I have found the easiest might be to focus on the body. It's the most, gross to subtle. It's something you can touch, it's tangible. Fixing the mind on the body each time the mind wanders, gently bringing it back to that point of attention. In the early Upanishads, the first kind of example of mindfulness that's provided is observation of the breath and or the sacred syllable Om, right? So bringing the mind to a singular point. When the mind wanders, we gently bring it back. And I know Dr. Chappell was on the call, so I'm kind of blending. Mindfulness comes out of a Buddhism lineage, and then single pointed focus is the earliest type of meditation, and that is more of a Hindi earlier classical thought. So there's complexity in the history, which I do touch on, just to know that mindfulness originates in 300 BCE, very old. So Lululemon did not come up with mindfulness. It has been around. So being conscious of time, thinking about this nervous system chart once again, just briefly. So the hardest part is awareness, is just noticing. It's easy to react to anxiety or react as you're in a state, identifying as being in a state of anxiety or depression or something in between. But it's harder to start to develop the mental muscle, which is actually, as you meditate or practice mindfulness, you are increasing gray matter in the insular cortex of the neocortex of the brain, which is responsible for altruism, compassion, empathy, and kind of this intuitive awareness. So the more you practice these things, the easier it becomes. I simply say the mental muscle to simplify. And so you become able, in a moment of high anxiety or feeling like you're in a funk, able to recognize and say, okay, I'm going to do X breath that will increase my heart rate because I'm lethargic, I'm stuck on off, I'm stuck in this hypo-vigilant, depressed state because all this stress has been happening. My nervous system's out of whack. I'm going to do this Kapalabhati breath that will increase my heart rate, bring more oxygen into the body to re-energize, and maybe a vigorous asana practice or movement or walking or running or biking, something rajasic, as they say in the yoga gunas, that will increase the heart rate. So when you do a fuller training in this, we actually have case studies, and I break people into groups and I have them, here's a 7-year-old with these kind of symptoms, maybe ADHD, hypervigilance. Here's a 50-something-year-old, having these issues with career, having this happen, taking care of sick loved ones. And from there, you identify where that person may be, where their nervous system may be in this fight or flight. Most likely the stuck on and off, this anxiety, depression, spiking. And acknowledging, okay, if they're stuck on and they have anxiety, their heart rate is already increasing, they're already tense, then we might do restorative asana, we might do extended exhales, we might do nadi shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, to re-regulate the body, and perhaps ask that they practice 2 minutes every day, that breath, and then come back and how are you feeling now, right? And same thing, if you're noticing, I might notice that I'm dragging, that my energy is low, I'm having a hard time motivating. Maybe I've had a lot of stress lately and I'm deregulated, and I say, hey, I think I'm stuck off in my nervous system code language that only I know. So, and now all of you. So going for walks every day, maybe challenging myself to go on a little bit more of a rigorous walk. My dog likes to run, so maybe I'll run a block or two with her. Doing some sun salutations, doing things that will kind of bring the energy level physiologically back up. And so there's plenty more training that would go into preparing you to guide others in that. But I think biggest takeaways are the normalization of this. There's nothing wrong. It's okay. And really, it's quite normal. I don't know how any of us would not be stuck in these cycles in the present day. So what can we do? What do we have control of? Our body and our breath. So coming into practice. I do want to just allude to the vagal theory, which is very important in this understanding of trauma, residual trauma. And I'll just show you this diagram. That the vagal nerve runs from the base of the brain or the neck here, all the way, cervical vertebrae, all the way down. And it innervates, it goes through all these different body systems. So if you remember, I said, you're a cave person running away from the cheetah. Do you have to stop and use the restroom? Probably not. Why? Because the vagal nerve innervates the digestive system. And you see, when the vagal nerve is activated in parasympathetic, our body is told it's okay to relax, slow the heart rate down, get the digestive juices going, come on, bile release. Now I can use the restroom because the cheetah's gone. But when we're stuck in an on position, high anxiety and stress, the vagal nerve isn't flowing the communication properly in the body, and we can be stuck in this fight or flight and you see for women that the ovaries and menstruation is affected. And if you're very high stressed, that might be a consequence as well. So interesting to learn once again, it's not so individual. There's science here to understand what and why the body is reacting in the way that it is. And we can do some practices to just help us move back into parasympathetic nervous system. Tell our body it's safe. There is no cheetah. It feels like there's a cheetah, but there's no cheetah. So I've got a few minutes, and now that I've shared about that, any quick questions? I usually do that in like an hour or two, and I threw it all at you. Feel free. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and find a comfortable seat. This was a lot of information today. I learned a lot. I'm grateful to be in shared space and to have these conversations. So you can find the feet hips width apart. So if you're in a chair, ideally it would be a hard surface. I'm on like a bouncy ball, so this is not ideal, but the idea is you can do it anywhere, anytime. You can be standing, laying down, or seated. Ideally a hard surface so you can feel your sits bones, the bony part of your bottom. And you might even shift the weight back and forth, side to side, just noticing where the body meets the chair or the earth beneath you. You can feel your feet firmly planted. Rest the hands on the knees or in the lap. And we just learned about that vagal nerve, so we want to make sure our spine is really straight and tall. You can bring the crown of the head up toward the ceiling. And go ahead and drop the gaze soft, or maybe even close the eyes if you're comfortable. In trauma-informed practice, it's all about options. I was noticing Lavinia gave a lot of options in her practice as well. It's about your own expression. So eyes open or closed, seated, reclined, standing. Notice how you feel in this moment. You might even bring one word to mind, just thinking of one word, how you feel. Could be tired, hungry, angry, happy, agitated. Maybe it's a curse word, only you know. Bring the one word to mind. Just notice and know that that is okay, whatever it is. So the spine is straight and tall, and notice the shoulders like to hold a lot of tension. Think about the burdens we carry on our backs, right? So see if you can roll the shoulders out, forward and back. And we'll do about a 5-minute practice. I'll make sure I get you guys out on time. So moving through the body as needed. You know your body best, so maybe you need to take a stretch or a twist or another movement to help yourself feel settled in this moment. So taking that, what we call intuitive movement, whatever you need is the right thing. And then settling into a seat once again. You can bring awareness to all the places your body touches the floor or is supported. So you might notice the feet planted on the floor, moving up through the legs and the knees. Just notice if there's any tension, any itch, any sensation. You could just kind of notice it with curiosity, adjust if needed, and then release into these areas, even heavier. Moving up through the legs and the hips, observing whatever there is to notice. Maybe even giving yourself some compassion, saying hey to the belly. Thank you for digesting all our food and absorbing nutrients so that we have energy. Moving up through the chest, perhaps tuning into the subtlety of your beating heart. Noticing the breath. Checking out if the lungs expand. Into what places, the chest, the belly. Just observing. Bringing awareness up through the shoulders. Notice the hands and the arms. Just check out if there's any tension there. You might even not even notice that you can release even more, taking any movement or adjustment along the way. Bring awareness to the face, noticing any muscles that are holding. See if you can release them. You can drop the tongue from the roof of the mouth to release the jaw. Even all the way up through the temples and the crown of the head, just see if you can release into these areas. Bring awareness back to the breath. We'll take a few extended exhales, one of my favorite breaths and the quickest, most effective at re-regulating parasympathetic nervous system. Hopefully not, but if you do have anxiety attacks, panic attacks, anything like that, or you know someone who does, this is a nice, quick way to help assist the body in re-regulating. So you can take a big breath in and just observe the front and back body expand. Really big breath, maybe do a count of 3 or 4 and hold at the top of the breath. On an exhale, sip the air as slow as you can go out the nose, maybe 6, 8, 10, even 12 counts. See how long you can get that exhale. Slowly sipping the air as you go. We'll take 2 more. Breathing in a count of 3 or 4. 3, 2, 1. Holding at the top. Exhale 6 or 8 counts. Challenging yourself. If you're working with kids at home with this breath, it's called snake breath, and you can hiss on the exhale. Maybe even pretend to be snakes while you're doing it. We'll take 1 more snake extended exhale breath together. Take a big breath in. Maybe 4 or 5 counts. Your lungs expand. Biggest, fullest breath, holding at the top. Exhale 8, 10, or 12 counts. Slowest, longest breath yet today. It's like you're competing with your last 2 exhales. This one's going to be even longer. Hissing it out if needed. Hiss until there's no air left in the lungs. Anything stuck or stagnant, released. Coming to an easy, natural pace of breath. We'll just take a very brief moment in stillness. If you notice the mind wander away, just gently nudge it back, bringing awareness back to the breath. Slowly, gently bring awareness back to your body on the earth, the rise and fall of your belly with breath. You can take a big inhale and let it go. Move through the fingers, the toes, waking the body up slowly. Maybe the shoulders roll or the neck forward and back. If you'd like, on an inhale, you can raise the arms all the way up, reawakening the body by lengthening through the spine. A big stretch. And exhale, perhaps the hands rest palms up in the lap. Noticing, checking in with yourself once more. What is one word you are now feeling? Just notice. It might be the same word as before, or it might be different. Finding your one word. And perhaps taking a moment in gratitude for the knowledge shared today, for the company and conversation, and for anything else. Thank you for sharing in practice and the honor to guide you. That is it. If anyone wants to put their one word, how they're feeling in the chat, throw it to us. It's cool to see just who's in the room and how everybody's doing.
Thank you so much for that. I am learning how to set myself up to be mentally and emotionally healthier during this time of lots of Zoom, lots of sitting, lots of heavy conversations, topics, lots of stress. So I have placed a yoga mat next to my desk just to remind me, get up and do something for 5 minutes. Give that 5-minute time for yourself. And then now you can go to the 99-cent store or Dollar Tree, pick up some crayons and some paper. And for $2, you can have a time for you to have the creative expression, sort of building that into your day. And then since I'm in health and human sciences, I'm going to make a big plug for hydration. I think a lot of us don't realize that stress can create toxins in our body, and that it's important to make sure that we're getting those toxins out. So I have started drinking, probably can't see it because of the virtual background, but 3 of these Nalgene bottles a day. So I'm very proud. I've been able to do that for almost a week now, and I feel so much better. Trying to practice what I teach my students, but cleansing your body through breath, through expressing your thoughts, through hydration, all 3 of those things are really critical for us as we navigate day by day. So I want to thank our 2 panelists. I want to thank you all for attending. This is a fun meeting / workshop / learning experience. And I'm very grateful to have been able to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of this community. So thank you all, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.